Buenos días a todas y a todos, bienvenidas otra vez a la tercera sesión del seminario organizado por el grupo de investigación STAN 1952 de la Universidad de Granada, por la Escuela Internacional de Posgrado y el Instituto Confucio de la Universidad de Granada, y con el apoyo del doctorado en Historia y Arte y el máster en Estudio de Asia Oriental. Gracias por estar aquí de nuevo. Vamos a empezar esta tercera sesión que cuenta con la presencia del profesor Jim Millward de la Universidad de Georgetown en Washington, Estados Unidos. Ayer, cuando hablábamos de cómo quería que se le presentara, estuvimos debatiendo un poco sobre cuáles eran los puntos más importantes que queríamos resaltar durante la presentación. Yo me podría tirar hablando como 3 días de lo que hace y de lo interesante que es su trabajo, pero creo que lo primero que hay que decir, que es normalmente lo último que se dice en sus presentaciones, es que toca el mandolín y es un músico. Además de tocar el mandolín y ser un músico, se empezó a interesar durante su estudio de pregrado por la historia de China y movió sus intereses hacia Asia Central porque se especializó en trabajar con la región de Xinjiang en el noroeste de China. Actualmente es profesor del Departamento de Historia y de la Escuela de Asuntos Exteriores de la Universidad de Georgetown y está realizando una serie de proyectos sobre Ruta de la Seda, Belt and Road Initiative y otros proyectos que tienen que ver también con música. No me voy a detener más en la presentación, le voy a ceder la palabra. La charla va a ser en inglés, para la alegría de muchas y muchos. Pero es un inglés muy comprensible y estoy convencida de que no vaya a tener muchos problemas en entender de lo que se va a hablar. En la segunda parte de la jornada vamos a proyectar una película y después vamos a tener un momento de debate, después de la clase y después de la película. Que disfrutéis mucho y gracias, Jim, por estar aquí.
Well, thank you very much. 各位同学们，大家好。早上好. Wow, okay, maybe I'll use English instead. So I have no idea whatsoever what Chiara just told you about me. There are many things she might have said. I hope she stuck to the best things. But I'm very pleased to be here today. I want to thank the Confucius Institute and the master's program in East Asia and all the other East Asian studies and all the other units of the university that have brought me here and are sponsoring this lecture. And I want to thank all of you for coming out. I'm very pleased to see such a large number of you, particularly since I never sent my title or the abstract of my talk to Chiara until last night. So I know you're all here without any idea whatsoever what you were expecting. So I'm all the more honored that you've come anyway. For all you know, I could be talking about mandolin playing on the Silk Road or something like that. But instead, my talk today is about, well, you can see the title there in front of you. Is this, if I'm back here, is that loud enough? Is that fine? I don't need to lean into the microphone.
Oís bien, ¿verdad?
Sí, okay. ¿Sí? Oh, sorry, one other thing too. I've asked Chiara to stop me if I'm unclear, but you can also wave and signal otherwise, and I'm happy to slow down. Or if there's something I talk about you don't know the background of, I'm more than happy to slow down and explain again. Anyway, so my talk today is on this subject, as you see, of Old World geoschemes and the Belt and Road Initiative, a Sino-Silk Roadist remapping of Eurasia. I've got some new terms in there that I will be explaining, in particular this idea of a geoscheme, which is an idea that I just sort of cooked up myself. I'm not sure if it's a good idea, so you are the guinea pigs, you are the test audience for this concept. And I'll be very curious to see in our discussions later on whether you think it's a useful idea or not. So that's part of what I'll be talking about, this sort of theoretical side. And then concretely, specifically, obviously I'm talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, China's big foreign policy initiative. And with no further ado, let me just get into it. Okay, so back in 1893, so a century and a quarter ago, the French novelist Jules Verne, he's very famous for writing adventure stories around the world in 80 days, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. He wrote a novel called Adventures of a Special Correspondent in Central Asia, or Claudius Bombernac was the name in French. And it was about a group of people riding a train all the way across Eurasia, starting from the Caspian Sea here, proceeding all the way across what's now Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, crossing over the Pamir Mountains, going through Xinjiang in western China, and all the way to Peking, all the way to Beijing. So this was in 1893, he wrote this novel. As you would expect, it's the standard kind of story. There's a cast of interesting characters, a couple of sort of Bostonians. There's a mysterious Oriental character. There's a devious Russian character, all riding the train together. And of course, there's drama and mystery, and they're attacked by bandits in Xinjiang and so on. So what's interesting about this novel, which you recognize the genre as I'm talking to you right now, but what's interesting about it is when he wrote it, it was science fiction. It was futuristic fiction, because that kind of a train did not exist all the way across Eurasia at the end of the 19th century. The American Transcontinental Railway had been completed in the middle of the 19th century. There was what's known as the Trans-Caspian Railway, which had gone part of the way from the Caspian to Tashkent, but it would not get to Tashkent until somewhat later, and it would never go on over the mountains into China. The Trans-Siberian Railway in the north would be started around end of the 19th century, a little later than this novel, but wouldn't get all the way to Vladivostok until 1916. And as far as western China, that is Xinjiang, and the railway going to Kashgar, there would be no railway to Kashgar until 1999, so 100 years after Jules Verne was imagining this railway. So this was futuristic fiction when he thought about it, the kind of fiction that takes cutting-edge new technology and imagines the next step, right? And this was the next step in the 19th century. Here we are 125 years later or so, and now the Belt and Road Initiative is actually planning to fulfill this dream of Jules Verne's from the end of the 19th century. Of course, they don't know that it's Jules Verne's dream. They think of it as China's dream or President Xi Jinping's dream that they're building. How many of you have heard of this Belt and Road Initiative? Not too many, maybe. I told her about it last night, so. No, that's not true. She knows. She knows very much. It's not surprising that not many of you heard about it. And in the United States, if I asked the same question to a group of university students, it would be the same. This is not well known in most of Europe. It's not well known in the United States. However, it is extremely well known in China, obviously, as a new policy, and quite well known in Central Asia, parts of South Asia, the Middle East, as the new face of China's foreign policy. as a very bold new initiative which China has presented to do several things. I think I have a map here. The first idea is that the Belt and Road Initiative will fund and build infrastructure all across Eurasia. In particular, fast rail lines, railways and trains. You can see some imagining of that here in this map. But also ports for shipping, roads, energy production, various kinds of infrastructure projects like that. And I'll talk more about that in a minute, but when we talk about the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, or One Belt, One Road, in Chinese it's known as 一带一路. So the belt goes across the north, across the continent, and that stands for Silk Road Economic Belt. And the road, this is rather strange, the road goes across the sea, but that's the Maritime Silk Road. Right? You know this term, Silk Road, yes? The, La Ruta de Seda? Okay. So it's this old idea of the Silk Road. Now, as I just said, in China, they don't know about Jules Verne's novel, obviously, but they do know about this idea of the Silk Road, La Ruta de la Seda. And it's a very sort of famous notion, but it's not an old one. We think of the Silk... So, first of all, let me define Silk Road, right? I'm sure you've heard of it. It's the idea that in the past, there was a route, or maybe some routes, all across Eurasia, linking in particular China with the Mediterranean, and that merchants moved silk and spices and other precious things and art across that route between the East and the West. And there were camels and caravans and all of this nice sort of exotic kind of stuff that is imagined. So that's it's not a common idea. It's in history textbooks. There are documentaries. You can go on a tour of the Silk Road. There are Silk Road restaurants, all of these kinds of things. But actually, the idea of the Silk Road is a very recent one. And it was invented only in the 19th century by this gentleman, Ferdinand van Richthofen, a German geographer. And incidentally, he is the uncle. I don't know if anyone knows Charlie Brown comics anymore. Do you know Snoopy the dog? Yeah. And he's fighting, against, in the airplane, he's fighting a World War I flying ace, right? That's the Red Baron. That's this guy's nephew. There was a real Red Baron, the nephew of Ferdinand van Richthofen. Has nothing to do with China. So Ferdinand van Richthofen was a geographer. He spent the 1860s, actually, in America, in California. He witnessed the building of the Transcontinental Railway in the across the United States. He also studied gold mines, the American gold rush. He was very interested in mining and minerals and trains and how you get iron and coal to factories. This is also the high point of industrialization. The Industrial Revolution is going on. Then in the 1870s, he went to China. He traveled around China a lot. He studied China. China, of course, was there, then was under the Ming Dynasty. But there were a lot of inroads by European countries, starting not exactly colonies, but they had footholds in the big cities of China, in Shanghai, on the Yangtze River. There were a lot of foreign economic interests. It's the period that Mao Zedong called semi-colonial in China. Van Richthofen was very interested in making it not semi-colonial, but completely colonial. He wanted to establish a German colony in China. He was very sort of working about that. And so he was very concerned about Chinese railroads, Chinese mines, minerals, the prospects for industrializing China. And at the same time that he was thinking about all of that, very sort of modern, imperialistic, industrialization kind of thinking, that's when he came up with the idea of the Silk Road, that in the past there had been a trade route all across Eurasia, linking Europe and China like that. And I think that's very interesting. It's an irony that we think of the Silk Road as antiquarian, as old-fashioned, as how economics worked a long time ago in the past. But actually, the Silk Road emerged from the age of imperialism. It emerged from the age of industrialization and reflects that kind of thinking about connections, about trade, about resources. So, is that clear? Do you see what I'm saying there? Okay. All right. So that's one irony about this idea of the Silk Road. There's another great irony, too, about the Belt and Road idea, particularly about the idea that China is now planning to build railways across Central Asia and South Asia itself. Because as some of you may know, if you've been studying contemporary Chinese history, I know, in the 19th century, as I said, the railroads that were built in China were predominantly built by foreign countries, foreign companies. They used foreign capital. And often these loans, the loans were forced upon the Chinese government at high rates of interest. So it was a kind of economic imperialism, and we could call it railroad imperialism that was building the rail in China in the 19th century. Now, a few provinces, in particular Sichuan province, began to fund railways locally. They began to use local Chinese capital to build their own Chinese railways. In the early 20th century, though, the Qing court, the dynasty, was very short of money. It was paying back the foreign coalition after the Boxer Rebellion. It had to pay a great indemnity. And so the Qing court decided to nationalize the local Chinese railroads, to make them national property, and then to mortgage them to the foreigners, to foreign banks, in order to help pay back the state's debt, to pay back the Qing Dynasty debt. Right? This is very famous, and in fact, that incident is what sparked the Shinhai Guoming, the Shinhai Revolution, the 1911 revolution. So the first revolution that brought down the dynasty in China was actually about railroads financed by foreign capital, right? Now, 100 years later, China wants to build railroads in these other countries financed with Chinese capital, right? It's an amazing change to happen in just 100 years, and yet another sign of something we all know about how rapid Chinese development has been. But it's also ironic that, at least if we look at it superficially, this is exactly the same game plan, the same sort of modus operandi that the imperialist Western countries had in China when China was developing. Now, of course, China does not talk about the Belt and Road Initiative as neo-imperialism. Right? They talk about it in a very different way. They focus on development, and this is China's effort to help poorer countries and its neighbors to develop. In many ways, they argue to follow the Chinese model of development, like this. And they build this whole idea of the foreign policy, of the Belt and Road Initiative. They build it upon the foundations of this idea of the Silk Road, which I've talked about, which is it's an idea that everybody likes. It's very popular. It refers to a common Asian past when merchants went back and forth on camels and everyone traded with everyone else. And as I'll say later, it refers to a peaceful past. It's a very peaceful idea, the Silk Road. Now, this idea of the Silk Road, though, is very complex. It has lots of different layers of meaning that have been added to it since the 19th century when it was invented. One of those is the image I've talked about before of camel caravans and silks and spices and happy merchants and so on. But it has also become kind of a fantasy view of the past, one that fits in very nicely with the neoliberal conception of a world economy, of a world order. Why is that? Because one of the ideas of a neoliberal economy is that free trade and independent trade is good for everyone, that everyone wins when you have a system that encourages free trade among countries. So, of course, the Trump presidency, the Trump administration in the United States is going against this sort of standard neoliberal model with his protectionism, right, which is one of the reasons why it's so upsetting to his friends on Wall Street. But this is, the idea. Private free trade was the mechanism whereby the old world, developed like this. Now, in fact, recent work on the Silk Road, some that I've written, some that other scholars have written, has challenged that idea, and in fact said that in the past there really wasn't a lot of free trade by merchants. Most of the silk and gold and silver and other things were moved by empires as part of strategic efforts, as part of thrusting their armies into the middle of the continent. So there's some controversy and complexity about that idea. Another idea that has stuck to, that has joined with the Silk Road notion, is that in the past it was a time of these great exchanges, cultural exchange as well as economic exchange, that medicine and literature and music and art and religion all sort of interchanged across the Silk Roads, creating new positive results, nice hybrids and syncretisms that promoted world culture, and in particular, that promoted our collective global culture. So in other words, the Silk Road is also a symbol which globalists, one world people, like to look at, as opposed to the idea of clash of civilizations. Samuel Huntington's notion that civilizations defined by different religions, Christendom, the Islamic world, maybe even the Confucian world, inevitably must fight. Silk Road counters that. It runs against that kind of idea. So that's another notion. I don't know if there's a musical project run by Yo-Yo Ma, the cellist. I don't know if any, Silk Road project. And he commissions music from all across Europe and Asia, and they play it with an orchestra which has Chinese musicians and Iranian musicians and European musicians. And the idea is everyone globally comes together and plays this collective music of ours together, and we all feel good, right? That's the idea. So there's that notion of Silk Road too. And that idea of Silk Road as cooperative globalism is the opposite of another notion we talk about when we talk about Central Asia, that of the Great Game. You may have heard of that. Strategic struggle between the British Empire and the Russian Empire in the 19th century over Central Asia and India. Again, this notion of competition. So the Silk Road as an idea is the flip side, we say, the opposite side of sort of Great Game notions. All right, so I've said that the Silk Road as we imagine it did not exist. It's an imaginary trope. that we talk about. But it's nonetheless, as an idea, it's very complicated. Right? It has many resonances with modern concerns and ideology. That kind of a regional historical idea, like sort of Silk Road, that's what I'm calling a geoscheme. So that's the new word that I have invented, just for you today, as my gift to the University of Granada. No, but this idea of a geoscheme. And I've come up with a very complicated kind of definition here, a meta-geographical regional entity with territorial, historical, political, cultural, economic, legal, and so on, dimensions, which can be manipulated, which can be used for geopolitical purposes, for ideological purposes. And just, I have a few other examples of similar kinds of things, and maybe you can see what I mean by this idea. So Silk Road as a geoscheme, Great Game, which I just talked about, is one. You've never heard of this, but in 2011, Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State in the US, in India, rolled out an idea to build a new Silk Road. And the American idea of the Silk Road was meant to link up South Asia, so India in particular, with Central Asia. And it used all of the same ideas about the Silk Road as a happy time of trade and commerce, making everybody happier. But the US idea of the Silk Road left out China and Iran, China and Persia. So if you can imagine a Silk Road without China and Persia, that's what the United States wanted to build. That's right. So it wasn't a very successful geoscheme, and we had no money. So it's very different from the Chinese Belt and Road idea. But it was an attempt to create a new geoscheme, to use geoschematic thinking as a foreign policy project. Some other kinds of geoschemes. Some of you may have heard of the Russian and Soviet notion of Eurasianism, that Russia occupies culturally and geographically a particular place between Europe and Asia. It's kind of half European, half Asian. And as a result, Russia is politically different. And this is used by Vladimir Putin and some of his associates as a kind of argument why Russia needs to have a strong man. Russia needs to be autocratic because it is Eurasian. It's not like those Europeans, those soft, effete Europeans or those stupid Americans. It's solid, like this. So that's a Eurasian idea. And the Eurasian Economic Union is, of course, former Soviet, right? It's a way to kind of rebuild part of the Soviet Union, but it's also founded on this historical idea as well. The notions of Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb, the world of Islam and the world of war, is similarly a geoscheme idea. In ancient Persian notions and in the Shahnameh by Ferdowsi from the 11th century, there's a sense of, they use these terms Iran and Turan. So Iran is the people of Iran, the Persian people. This word is actually related to the word Aryan, if you know that term. Is that in Spanish as well? But Turan is, from the point of view of Persians, the lands to the north where tribal people, nomads, were the Turks. So it was Persians versus Turks. They divided the world in those kind of schemes. Asia and Europe, we use these words all the time as if they're separate unities, but of course geographically it's impossible to draw a line. In the 5th century BC, Herodotus said, yes, he wrote, I've always been puzzled why we use 3 women's names for these 3 parts of one land, Asia, Europa, and Libya, which is the word he used for Africa. Why do we talk about them with these 3 women's names? Everyone can see that they're all connected and there's no real division. So he noticed this in the 5th century BC, but then he said, but I'm going to use the words anyway because it's traditional. So already in the 5th century BC, we were locked into these notions. But even in ancient Greek literature, there's already a sense of cultural difference between Asia and Europe. And Herodotus was talking about the Scythians, who were nomadic people. Some of you who do archaeology may know about the Scythian people. But they were nomadic, fighting against Persia. There was already a kind of sense of economic, political, and particularly cultural difference between those Asians and people further to the west. Of course, Occident and Orient are similar kinds of ideas related to Europe and Asia. We all know Edward Said's discussion about this. But it's interesting, since Herodotus or earlier, we have put so much cultural, political significance upon these ideas of Occident and Orient, even though we know they're not real. And in particular, the idea of Asia or the Orient, it includes so much difference. South Asia, the Islamic world, China, Japan, a completely heterogeneous idea. Nonetheless, we still kind of use it. So I'm arguing then that the Belt and Road Initiative is a new geoscheme, but one that's founded upon similar kinds of principles, and as I'll explain as we go, that actually has elements of all of these other, many of these other geoschemes within it as well. Okay. So let me just talk a little bit more in concrete terms and specific terms about what is proposed for the Belt and Road Initiative. This is the kind of information that you'll find in the newspaper accounts and in those kinds of articles that come from think tanks and so on. This is the way most people have been trying to analyze the Belt and Road. What projects will there be? How is the financing going to work? How does this fit into the world economic order, and so on? So a couple things about it. One sees different figures of money, different dollar figures used, but something in the low trillions is proposed in investment to build new infrastructure across some 68 countries which have been included in this Belt and Road zone. One interesting thing about this is that the idea of Belt and Road was only introduced in 2013, but many of the projects, the bridges, the roads, the ports, many of these projects have been ongoing for years before that. So it's not as if it's all new. The idea is new, and it's been used to encompass sort of many, many older things that are already going. Rail, ports, roads, industrial parks, energy plants, and so on are all part of this. I believe even the Greek port, I forget the name, what it is, but there's a Greek port that China has been rebuilding, yes? Pires, yeah. I believe they kind of talk about that within this Belt and Road. Do they? Do you know? Have you seen Belt and Road used to describe this Greek port? Yes. So that's incorporated, but that, of course, has been ongoing for many years. The port in Pakistan, and so on. So it's a catch-all. It's an overall umbrella term for a lot of these kind of investments. Lots of what's going on in Africa, China's investing in Africa, of course, has been going on for decades. That is now, particularly East Africa, that is now incorporated under the rubric of Belt and Road as well. One thing that doesn't get reported on very much, though, is the cultural projects that are also put under the label of Belt and Road. There's tons of Belt and Road tourism, museum exhibitions, lots of archaeological work. I know many of you are studying archaeology, and in some ways, Belt and Road has been a gift, has been a boon to certain kinds of archaeology. It tends to be archaeology with a Chinese connection. For example, a Chinese vessel that sunk in the South China Sea. There's been an effort to, well, it's been brought up, it's been studied, its cargo has been analyzed, And a lot of money was poured into that project to create a museum around this vessel and things. Silk Road studies in Central Asia, a lot of joint projects involving Chinese archaeologists and local Central Asian archaeologists. But if you want to get some money for your own project in archaeology, maybe here in Granada, just talk about Granada as a Belt and Road city on the Silk Road and apply for Chinese money, and you might be successful. I'm being sarcastic, but I've done exactly the same thing myself with these kinds of geoscheme concepts. They're popular, and they get politicians and fundraisers interested. So as scholars, this is something we have to be very aware of. UNESCO. There have been some UNESCO projects, UNESCO sites. Of course, you know the whole process of UNESCO World Heritage Sites. That has become very involved in sort of Belt and Road politics as well, with an interesting result that it used to be UNESCO sites were only defined by a nation. They were national. So whatever nation you were, you put forward your own cultural heritage site, your own intangible cultural heritage idea, and tried to promote it and get it accepted by the United Nations. Now there are more multi-state and sort of regional UNESCO proposals. And China has been sort of leading some of those because, of course, Silk Road is by definition supranational, above the nation, beyond, trans-regional like this. So it's had effect on world archaeological politics and world arts politics as well. One thing which the foreign policy and international relations scholars and the economists are very interested in is how Belt and Road projects will be financed. There was a bit of a controversy a few years ago. China announced it was going to start its own development bank, the Asian Industrial, AIIB, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting all the I's, but International Industrial something bank like that. Infrastructure, thank you, of course. So you obviously know more about this than me. So, Asian Industrial Infrastructural Bank, right? Kind of like the World Bank, kind of like the International Monetary Fund, and obviously this is China sort of trying to play a larger role in the world of multilateral banking, multilateral development financing. The Obama administration in the United States, I think it was a big mistake, opposed this and tried to get American allies not to join, not to invest in the AIIB. That was a total failure. Everyone invested. Japan, Britain, all of our close allies said, no, this is a good thing. And I think it is, because it's very public. It's operating in quite a transparent way. It's trying to use the standards of multilateral financing, at least as well or better than the World Bank and IMF. But it's a challenger in that field. Anyway, so this question of whether these many projects are going to be financed bilaterally, by China simply investing and paying for it, or whether it'll be in these broader multilateral kind of things. That's sort of one of the points of interest. One recent news story is about a port in Sri Lanka. Some of you may have heard about this, which was built with Chinese financing to sort of upgrade and make it global standard. Sri Lanka has not been able to pay back the debt for that construction, though. And so there was a deal that was just announced last year. They'll be trading debt for equity. And so the port is now being leased to a Chinese state-owned firm for 99 years. So this is the kind of deal which makes people nervous, makes people worried about the Belt and Road, because that looks kind of a lot like the deal which Great Britain had for Hong Kong, leasing it from China for 99 years. Of course, that was only turned over in 1997. And it gives China a foothold in Sri Lanka that some people see as perhaps of concern. Anyway, So those are some of the material aspects of the Belt and Road, which many of you, some of you know about. I'm going to be talking not about that. So I'm going back to sort of the conceptual and the idea of Belt and Road as a geoscheme. When should I go until? Yeah, 9:30 or something like that, or 10?
10:30?
All right, well, I won't go all the way till 10:30, but okay. Yeah. So one of the conceptual aspects of Belt and Road that I think is really interesting it has to do with, well, it has to do with how it talks about, that is, the propaganda, the rhetoric, the speeches about the Belt and Road, how they use the language of development, of international development. And this is, to a great degree, something new, I think, in Chinese foreign policy. In the past, there have been many ideas about Eurasian land bridges that China has proposed. For decades, they've talked about building new Silk Roads through Western China, Eurasian land bridges across Eurasia, but it's a bridge to get to where? To get from China to Europe, to ship Chinese goods to the markets in Europe, but have not paid close attention to the countries in between China and Europe. It's kind of that old Silk Road idea that all that matters is China and Rome, Han Dynasty and Rome. So the older notions of bridges and Silk Roads and so on that Chinese policy has used have skipped over everything in between. The rest of Eurasia has been a corridor. The Belt and Road, though, is quite different in that regard. It talks about not just getting Chinese products to European markets and things like this. It talks about developing the countries in between, developing neighbors, win-win cooperation, and so on. And this shows that China is very much trying at least to use the language of being a global partner, of being a good global citizen. Some of you may have noticed that Chinese President Xi Jinping, I believe last year, went to the Davos conference, which is, of course, where all the sort of globalists and so on get together. And there he sounded precisely like an American president, talking about global free trade being good for everyone. That is, an American president before our current one. So people were joking that Xi Jinping had become, Davos man, the great internationalist, right? This was very intentional, obviously, on Xi Jinping's part, because he wanted to sound this kind of notion to show that China was going to be trying to play this role in the world. And the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative language, is sort of all about that. So that's new, as is this attentiveness, this concern or expressed concern for developing countries of Central Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and so on. Now, this idea of looking to the West, idea of China paying more attention to Central Asia and the Islamic lands, and so on, this has origins in an article by a foreign policy specialist in China, a man named Wang Jisi. And he is a professor of international relations at Beijing University, and in fact, the chair of their international studies center there. So a very sort of prominent international relations scholar in China. And in 2012, he published an editorial. It also came out in English, and I suppose other languages as well, which suggested that China should march west, should look west as its new, as a new direction for its foreign policy. And in particular, he argued that this was a strategic rebalancing which China should do. Now, this was the period of time when the United States, the Obama administration, had been talking about a pivot to Asia. A pivot, like this chair is pivoting. Oops. There we go. A pivot to Asia, or a strategic rebalancing towards Asia. And what this meant in terms of US foreign policy and security was that we realized we were spending far too much time, too much money in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, and it was, of course, making things worse, not making things better. The future economically was obviously in East Asia. The US needed to pay more attention, and even strategically, the US believed it needed to pay more attention to that. So Obama really spent his whole 8 years trying to get out of the Middle East and to do more with Asia like this. Of course, wasn't particularly successful. But this idea of US strategic rebalancing inspired Wang Jisi to think about, all right, what should China do? He thought China should look west as a way of avoiding problems, of avoiding friction in the East. Fighting over small islands, perhaps with Japan, the Philippines, the United States. That US was leaving a vacuum, and the West, to a great degree, was leaving a vacuum in Central Asia and South Asia. And that presented China with an opportunity to expand its diplomatic influence, to expand its economic influence, and so on. So he argued it was something of although he called it Xi Jinping advance to the West, it was more of almost a strategic retreat or a reorientation as a way of taking advantage of this opportunity where China would not run into problems with the US. What interests me is when he talked about this, the way he talks about these Western countries, he uses terminology which comes from China's history. So he talked about the Xibu, sort of western parts, not Central Eurasian countries. He used this kind of shorthand term, which again, those of you who know Chinese, Xibu was very similar to Xiyu, the western regions, which was how everything to the west was talked about in ancient Chinese, in classical Chinese, in the Han Dynasty and the Tang Dynasty. He used terms from ancient Buddhism, Pure Land. He said, the West, it's not going to be a Pure Land paradise. There are going to be challenges. But in evoking these terms, Chinese readers who see this would think of the glorious times of China's imperial past, the Han Dynasty, the Tang Dynasty, times when China expanded to the West and had all of these great connections with the West through the Silk Road and so on. And so he used this past glory as a way of selling, as a way of arguing for this strategic reorientation in the present. I think he was very much trying to diffuse possible tensions between a very nationalistic China and the United States in making that argument. He also uses the term there, the core lands of Asia, or Oya Kexin Didai. So this is a term that evokes another geoscheme, another discourse about geopolitics, and that's the heartland theory, or heartland of Asia theory, or the geographical pivot of Asia theory. This political scientist named Halford Mackinder was writing again in the early 19th century. In a very influential article in 1904, he used this term, the geographical pivot of Asia, of history, arguing that Central Asia was in fact that important pivot point around which world power turned. This seems very odd to us now. We think of Central Asia as remote and cut off. But his argument had to do with land power versus sea power. A few years later, he elaborated on that and talked about the heartland of Asia. And he argued that whoever controls Eastern Europe can then control the heartland, because the heartland is far from the sea. So British maritime imperial power was no good in Central Asia, is the argument. And then whoever controls the heartland of Asia can control what he called the world island. In other words, all of Eurasia. And therefore, if you controlled the world island, you could control the whole world. This was his argument. Doesn't really make sense, and particularly in modern times with airplanes, it makes no sense at all. But at the time, he thought that, in fact, the rise of railway would mean that landlocked interior spaces of continents would again be important relative to the sea, because rail would turn it would sort of change the balance of communications ability away from the sea again back to the land. Anyway, this is really the origins of the notion of geopolitics, of geography and politics, which is how people often think about global strategy nowadays. Anyway, so these ideas, although they're sort of old in their specifics, became quite popular again in the early 2000s in China. And a lot of people were kind of talking about the heartland theory. And I think they underlie Wang Jisi's idea of marching west. I think he was thinking about that. He uses this term, the core lands of Asia, and how important they are. So here's another old geoscheme that is sort of part of this thinking that is the background to the Belt and Road. Now, of course, there's a difference between Wang Jisi's idea that China should just look west, look to the continent. A difference between that and the Belt and Road as it came out a couple years later as official Chinese policy. And the big difference is, let's see, I'm jumping ahead, I had this map. All right, we'll use this map. The big difference is that the Belt and Road, this is a better one, that the Belt and Road includes the sea, right? It's not just the continental areas, but they added in this whole notion of the maritime Silk Road as well, and that China will also be building infrastructure there. And that changes the whole strategic picture. It changes the whole strategic thrust of Belt and Road, turns it from being a rebalancing or even a strategic retreat for China into really something that's quite assertive, into an intent to advance. Because as you know, China has been advancing in the South China Sea, developing small atolls into air bases and developing islands, competing with the Philippines and Vietnam over territory. They've been asserting territorial control deep down into the South China Sea, hundreds of miles from the Chinese border, on the basis of historical arguments that this was China's, a Chinese lake in the past, and so on. And by establishing footholds in the Indian Ocean as well, they're challenging U.S. and Indian power in that region. So adding the sea, adding the sea route to the land route in BRI makes it this much more of assertive kind of policy. And if I mention in particular where some of these ports are, you'll see what I mean. China has been developing or building ports in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, in Gwadar in Pakistan. More recently now, there's some question about the Maldives. I don't know if you've been following news from the Maldive Islands, but there's political struggle there. And one side is appealing to China, and the other side is appealing to India for political and possibly military support. So China would be very interested in having a base in the Maldives as well. And so this strategy has been called the string of pearls idea, that they're putting these economic ports, supposedly, but strong Chinese footholds all around Indian Ocean. And of course, India is aware of this. There's now a group called the Quad of India, Japan, Australia, and the United States, which is talking about strategically countering China's advance like this. They're even talking about building their own infrastructural projects to compete with the Chinese infrastructural projects, which is probably not a good idea. But so you can see that the strategic implications of this are not being missed. And of course, the U.S. has sent so-called freedom of navigation operations into the South China Sea, where we sail our naval ships around in places where China says we shouldn't. And it's a kind of game of chicken that's going on. So it's quite worrisome, actually, right? Now, of course, the rhetoric of the Belt and Road Initiative, though, deliberately tries to avoid this sense of strategic tension. It's trying to be much more about soft power than it is about hard power. And this is where the rhetoric and the historical narratives behind the Belt and Road, I think, become particularly important. And so now I'm going to sort of analyze some of those specific aspects. I've frozen up here. All right, so this, of course, is President Xi Jinping. This is his speech at Nazarbayev University in 2013, when he laid out he had two key speeches which announced the Belt and Road. One he delivered in Kazakhstan about the belt over land. Another he delivered in Indonesia in 2013, a couple months later, about the road by sea. And of course, there's been many, many other speeches by Chinese leaders and others talking about this. When he spoke in Indonesia, this was at a forum for international cooperation in 2015. This is the big Belt and Road international announcement, and various leaders from the world went and attended. There, Xi Jinping talked about this figure, Zhang He. How many of you have heard of the Ming Dynasty Admiral Zhang He? Okay, so he was a Muslim, interestingly, from Yunnan, southern China. He had been made a captive as the Ming Dynasty took over from the Mongols. And there were many Muslims in China during the Mongol period. And he was castrated, so he was a eunuch, but he worked his way up the political ladder and became a close advisor to the emperor, the Ming emperor. And they together came up with an idea to send a series of voyages, expeditions, maritime expeditions, through the South China Sea, Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean, all the way to Africa, Eastern Africa, and to Mecca even, the Persian Gulf and the Islamic lands. So from the early 1400s through 1433, there were 7 of these missions, with large armadas of ships, huge boats, larger than the Spanish Armada by far. I'm sorry about that. Also, his ships were like 5 times the size of Columbus's ships 100 years later. Very impressive naval voyages. And there's been a lot of talk about this recently, and a lot of kind of false stories saying that he also discovered America, that he went through the Arctic, that he went to Australia. He's become very sort of popular, and this kind of popular history has said all kinds of false things about him. But he's a great hero, of course, in China. And it's interesting to see the way Xi Jinping talks about him. So Zhang He, famous Chinese navigator in the Ming Dynasty, made 7 voyages to the Western Seas, which means the Indian Ocean, a feat which is still remembered today. These pioneers won their place in history. not as conquerors with warships, guns, or swords. Rather, they're remembered as friendly emissaries leading camel caravans on land and selling treasure-loaded ships. Generation after generation, the Silk Route's travelers have built a bridge for peace and East-West cooperation, right? So you can see rhetorically what he's doing. Zheng He, he's arguing, was an ambassador of peace and friendship to the west of Asia. Now, historians will tell you that's completely wrong. These huge ships that he had were full of soldiers. They didn't have cannons on the side like the European vessels would have later, so they didn't engage in battles on the sea. But they carried tens of thousands of troops, and when they sailed into your port, and you were a little prince or little king, or maybe a not so little prince or little king, nonetheless, you had to pay attention. And so, among some of the things that Zheng He did, they went to Sri Lanka. They instigated a military coup and overthrew the king, took him captive, brought him back to Beijing, and put in their own puppet ruler in Sri Lanka. They kidnapped or convinced other rulers to come with them back to Beijing as well. They intervened in various kinds of local struggles, and basically were sort of parading Ming Dynasty power over this vast region for a couple of decades, primarily for imperial prestige. They weren't establishing colonies. There was trade, but it wasn't significant. It was more about sort of prestige like this. But it's been redescribed as peaceful in this way. So let's compare another hero. This is Zhang Chen, who very famously, we're often told, opened the Silk Road in the 1st century BC. He went out from Xi'an, then China's capital, across Central Asia, ended up in what is now sort of Uzbekistan or around the borders, and there was engaged in some negotiations with a group of people known as the Kushans or the Yuezhi. Now, the way that you can see from his speech here, Xi Jinping was an envoy in Central Asia. He opened the door to friendly contacts between China and Central Asia, as well as the Silk Road, again, linking East and West Asia and Europe. Right? So Zhang Chen is a founder of the Silk Road in this narrative. And again, an ambassador of peace and friendship, as we're told. In fact, of course, the story was very different. The Han Dynasty had been engaged in an ongoing Cold War, sometimes hot war, with nomads in what is now Mongolia, a group of people known as the Xiongnu, also the Huns, right? You may have seen the Disney movie Mulan, right? You know, let's get down to business to defeat the Huns, right? That's who they're talking about, the Xiongnu, right? And you've seen that picture of the Xiongnu Shanyu, that scary man, right? So this is who the Han were fighting against. They were looking for allies against the Huns. So they went out to Central Asia to find another nomadic group which had in fact been defeated in the past by the Huns, and they thought they might still have an animus against them and be useful as an ally. So that's what Zhang Chen was about. It was military and strategy. It wasn't peace and friendship. He wasn't trying to open the Silk Road. The Silk Road idea wouldn't be invented for 2,000 years. In any case, but he's defined very differently in BRI propaganda like this. So one question is why, and it's obvious, right? If you're trying to sell the Belt and Road Initiative to convince people to join in and to see China as a good global citizen, then obviously you don't want to talk about military enterprises in the past, China's strategic expansion or anything like that. You want to emphasize the soft side. And so this is where that idea of the Silk Road as a peaceful conduit of communication, cultural exchange, and free trade, that's where that idea becomes so useful, right? Because it plays up all of these good things and plays down the strategic great game kind of competition, right? Which everyone, that is the US and others, are very suspicious of China's intent. So we want to see BRI as strategic. They're saying, no, no, it's cultural, it's economic. And look at these great heroes who founded it. But the idea of the Silk Road, though, also does something else at a slightly different level. Because even though it links up with Europe, it is kind of an Asian notion, right? The Silk Road crosses Asia. Most of the places that it crossed are in Asia. And so when talking about that, this is an idea that can unify the countries of Eurasia, particularly between the Middle East, Iran, and China, a little more so than it does in Europe. And we see that this thread, this stream of ideology in some of these speeches as well. I'm sorry, there's a big fat piece of text here. This is another speech of Xi Jinping's, again to a group of countries which had come together recently. I think I actually have the wrong, this is the wrong identification there. It was at a speech in Shanghai. In any case, here he's talking about, finally, the people of Asia should run the affairs of Asia. It's up to Asians to solve Asian problems and uphold security. We're capable and we're wise enough to do this. The Chinese people have been pursuing a Chinese dream, and we can help the rest of Asia pursue an Asian dream. The China dream, of course, is Xi Jinping's signature domestic ideology, his domestic program. Everyone will achieve their dream. Lasting peace and common development, and so on. So this speech, when he first made it, the media and observers immediately jumped and said, aha, Xi Jinping is now talking about Asia for the Asians. In other words, the implication of this is the West, and in particular the United States, should stay out of Asian business, and Asians should take care of their own affairs. There are many resonances with this. One of them, which people pointed out immediately, is the idea of, in Imperial Japan, they talked about a greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. That was their euphemism for the Japanese Empire, but they called it an Asian zone where all Asians can solve Asian problems and Asians will get together and be prosperous together. So some of the commentators pointed out the parallels between Xi Jinping's Asia for Asians and this kind of Asian co-prosperity idea. And actually, it's very similar to this kind of new Silk Road, Asian prosperity. This idea that there's an ancient historical Asian community which was peaceful and which was trading together for everyone's common prosperity, this resonates with other ideas too, namely the idea that the East is culturally different from the West. The East is peaceful, pacifistic, spiritual. The West is aggressive, materialistic, right? You recognize that Orientalist division too, right? It comes up in all sorts of places. Gandhi talked in those terms. The Indian poet Tagore, very famous kind of internationalist, talked that way. There's elements of that argument in the non-aligned movement in the Bandung Conference as well, including Africa as well as Asia. But this kind of anti-Western notion that there's this peaceful community unlike the aggressive West, right? There's the argument of Asian values, which was most famously put forward by the Singapore Prime Minister of many decades, Lee Kuan Yew. And Lee Kuan Yew argued that Asians are collectivistic. They like to work together, whereas Westerners are individualistic who like to compete against themselves, against each other. And that because Asia is collectivistic, therefore the sort of Western liberal democracy doesn't work. And therefore, Lee Kuan Yew said, it's okay that I'm an authoritarian, right? It was an excuse for autocracy, kind of light dictatorship in Singapore. But this idea, of course, is very popular. It's been very popular for autocrats anywhere in Asia, and particularly for the Chinese Communist Party. They make a very similar argument that we're different. We have Asian values. They're different from your Western values. Your Western value of democracy doesn't apply here, right? So in evoking this notion of Asia is good for Asians and let's keep the Westerners out, Xi Jinping is pulling on all of this kind of history of ideas that distinguish Asia from the West culturally and allow for different kinds of politics, in particular authoritarian politics. All right, I'm beginning to wrap up here. I thank you very much for your patience. Wait, not yet. Almost. I can tell you're eager. All right. One more of these geoschemes I wanted to introduce. So, all right. So far I've been talking, Asia for the Asians, all of this soft power kind of thing. Zheng He and Zhang Chen, these Chinese heroes, are ambassadors of peace and friendship, right? But why are there Chinese heroes at all, right? If you wanted to talk about the historical community of the Silk Road, you don't need to put Chinese in charge of it, right? To give it that nationalistic element as well. But of course, this whole idea has to function at a different level, at a national level within China and be popular in China. And so that's why you have Chinese heroes, Zhang Chen, Zheng He, in charge. They help to make this popular in China. China's, again, see their own imperial glory reflected in this new idea of the Belt and Road. And not only that, these are not average Chinese people. This is not some merchant. It's not even a religious pilgrim. Xuanzang, the famous Tang Dynasty pilgrim, traveled extensively. He's a Silk Road hero as well, right? Or Marco Polo, for example. They could have used Marco Polo. No, Zheng He and Zhang Chen are government officials, right? Highly backed imperial officials. So this is also saying in China's past, as in the future, the Chinese state, just like the Chinese Communist Party today, we're doing all of these great things, and our officials are going to open up a new Belt and Road like this. All right. So this then resonates with another kind of geoscheme that's floating out there, ideas that have been sort of repopularized lately. Goes by different kinds of names: the tributary system, the traditional Chinese world order, or Tianxia, all under heaven. This is a very Sinocentric notion. The argument goes that in the past, China's foreign relations and economic relations with East Asian countries, its neighboring countries, were hierarchical. China was at the center and also at the top, but because China was benign, was a beneficent hegemon, was a beneficent supreme ruler in this system, other countries came and willingly traded and willingly bowed before the emperor, and that this created a system, an international system, that maintained peace. But it was very different from the Westphalian system of supposedly equal states or of any kind of democratic system. It was a hierarchical and yet peaceful system like this. Now, this idea has roots in the Chinese classics. It was described by a historian of China named John King Fairbank starting in the late 1960s and became very much a core idea of historiography of China, that this is how China's traditional foreign relations worked. Starting in the 1980s and 1990s, it has been revised and now completely rejected. It was an ideal that some people had, but in reality, it never really looked like this, right? And in fact, it wasn't particularly peaceful. Asia was no less prone to war than Europe at certain times. and so on and so forth. So I could lecture for another hour about that. But so it's an idea that historians, scholars have dismissed, but political scientists in the last few years Western political scientists have picked up on it again, and many Chinese philosophers have sort of looked at it again. And it's had this renaissance as an idea because people think, if this is how the past worked, maybe with China's rise, then the future of Asia, or maybe the world, will look similar. It will sort of China at the center. China will be the most powerful hegemon. But maybe this does not necessarily mean that there needs to be strategic rivalry. Maybe this does not mean that the other countries of Asia will join together, maybe with the United States, to counterbalance China. Maybe this kind of peaceful, Confucian peace, can function again. So that idea is out there too. And I would say that, well, within the propaganda of the Belt and Road, within the rhetoric of the Belt and Road, they do not talk about Tianxia. They do not talk about tributary system, for obvious reasons. No, China's neighbors don't like the idea of a hegemonic China in charge of everything, right? But the idea is not incompatible with the Belt and Road. And I would say at the national level in China, when they talk about this, it's very much resonating with signaling to people that the future will be sort of Chinese-led, and that there can be a system, something like this again, which the Belt and Road can form. So just to conclude now, what I'm saying is that this Belt and Road idea, if you look at its rhetoric, at its propaganda, it's founded on this geoschematic idea of the Silk Road, but it had elements of the heartland theory, of sort of the Asian values argument, the Great East Asian Coast Prosperity Sphere, and also this Tianxia tributary system, traditional world order. And what's interesting about it is these different geoschemes all resonate in this one big propaganda package, but they function at different levels, right? So BRI, at a global level, it's about development, it's about China being a global citizen. They talk about the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, also will include Latin America, also will include the Arctic. There's an article I found about the Belt and Road in outer space. They're talking about the new Belt and Road of space, right? So the sky is literally the limit. It's not the limit. The sky is not the limit for Belt and Road. So it's a global idea, right? And everyone's welcome. Africa, the Arctic, and so on. At a kind of broad regional level, sort of the old Silk Road level and Asia, it has this other kind of Asia for Asians, this notion of the East being distinct politically and culturally from the West, but also being kind of unified historical zone with lots of shared culture and ideas that makes Asia, Asia. And then at the local or the national level in China, of course, it appeals to Chinese nationalism. It appeals to historical eras of Chinese greatness. And this makes sort of Chinese very happy as well. So many people are quite cynical about the Belt and Road Initiative. They think it is a lot of empty propaganda that is sort of covering up China's strategic intent, and that this is all about a Chinese play to take over the world, and we need to defend against it, and so on and so forth. I think it's going to depend. It's really lots of different projects, lots of different things going on at once. You have to look one by one. Maybe this port will be useful. Maybe that train or those roads will really have good economic benefits for the local people. This museum exhibition is interesting. It could be good. There's a grant waiting for some archaeologists to get. So you have to look individually at all of these different things that are lumped together as Belt and Road. But I think the thinking behind it and this ideology behind it is complex enough, is powerful enough that you can't just dismiss it as a covering, as a veil. I I think you have to take it somewhat seriously as a statement of how China wants to project itself in the world today. And I'll stop talking. So now you can clap.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias por esta charla. ¿Me entiendes, no? Gracias también por crear por nosotros el concepto de geoscheme. Cuando sea World Trending Topic, te acordarás de nosotros y nos reiremos de eso. Queremos pasar a las preguntas. ¿Hay alguien que quiera tomar la palabra? Hola, buenos días. Todo está.
Por ejemplo, las vías como tiene Rusia, infraestructuras como por ejemplo el Trans-Siberian, que hay algunas vías que llegan casi a Europa, utilizar países intermedios, a lo mejor no hay tal radiación cultural, pero sí que hay una manera rápida de sacar mercancía y hacer un antiguo aliado. No sé, yo suelto la idea que no sé si sería interesante.
Suéltamela de manera que yo la pueda traducir, por favor. Sí.
No sé si conocéis que es un tren que va por toda la comunidad antigua Rusia. Entonces, si se podía utilizar vías como esa, por ejemplo, para sacar mercancías y un poco esa... No sé si China tenía alguna pretensión, no sé, una pregunta que me hace. No sé cómo preguntar.
Por favor.
Thank you. It was asking about this routes, the Trans-Siberian routes, if China could use that to move goods and mercancies through Asia, or if it just wants to build new ones.
Good question. So you all heard the question. The question, I believe, was sort of about to what extent is China using existing train lines already and then building the new ones. And I've been trying to, well, I'm not an expert on the specific kinds of things of Belt and Road. I have been trying to follow that because the interesting aspect there has to do with what's called the gauge of the rail. Well, it has to do with a couple of questions. The width of the tracks, and there are different. This is a legacy of imperialism and everything else. The Soviet width is different from the Chinese width. The Chinese rail widths are the same actually as Iran. And so one of these ideas is to go all the way through Xinjiang and then down through Pakistan and from there into Iran, and then you can actually leave things on the same train, although building trains across the Karakoram Mountains is not going to be easy. And then there's also the question of, all right, to what extent does China want sort of Russia to be involved in this, or would China like to do it itself through the other non-Russian countries of Central Asia? And as far as I can tell, the way it's going now is kind of a mix of the two. China has agreed to build, I think, a fast rail between Kazan and Moscow, I think. Part of the problem is there'll be an announcement of some plan that they are going to do this, announcing all this investment. And whether it actually happens or not, you don't always know. And sometimes it doesn't happen. There's a big announcement of the plan. So I'm not quite sure where that stands. But they have announced to build fast rail within Russia, according to Chinese specifics. Mainly, though, I think it's going through Kazakhstan. They've already started that. Uzbekistan, of course, is politically a bit of a problem, just because they're so sort of isolated. And many of these countries are potentially unstable. Karimov has died. What's going to happen in Kazakhstan when Nazarbayev, their president, dies? They've been presidents for life. So there are gambles for China. But the advantages for the Russian side is that you only have to deal with one player. But that's also the disadvantage. You're dealing with one relatively powerful player rather than a lot of the smaller ones. So I'm sorry, that's not really an answer to your question, but I think that is a good question. That's the core of the question.
There was allies and I don't know if it's possible that Australia was communist and have a special deals between them, or have I don't know, they connect, Russia connect with the whole world, and probably China have some interest about that.
Connecting with the Trans-Siberian or with...
Yeah, or Russia from Europe
yeah.
with China, and they have
right.
structures.
Yeah. I mean, right, so you're right, that rail is there. I think one of the arguments that foreign economists have made for the real reason behind Belt and Road is that China has an excess of steel, an excess of steel manufacturing capability. They have excess of cement. And as the Chinese economy slows, all of these factory workers making steel and cement, there's a problem that, and you can't, they're state-owned factories, you can't simply close them. So one argument is that Belt and Road is meant to build a lot of projects just to use up Chinese capacity. And some have said, no, you can build all the BRI projects, they still wouldn't begin to use up all of China's excess capacity. But I think from the narrow national interest perspective, one of the great purposes here is to have projects that Chinese companies and Chinese labor will be engaged in building. And so they're less interested in using existing rail. Also, I think the Trans-Siberian is probably pretty slow. And China now knows how to build these fast trains very effectively.
Sí.
Yo quería saber cuáles serían las implicaciones, o sea, de esto en las relaciones entre Estados Unidos y Europa.
What would be the implication of this Belt and Road initiative between the relationship the United States with Europe?
So we've seen this very good question again. You've seen this recently when British Prime Minister Theresa May was in China recently. And of course, many people were disappointed. She didn't talk about human rights and so on. She did talk about Belt and Road. There's been a supposed Belt and Road train going all the way to Britain, just to show, I think it kind of, wasn't the direct route, but you can create a route. And with, one of the arguments for Brexit, or one of the ways in which Britain is trying to deal with Brexit, is to enhance its own bilateral relations with China. And they were, the argument is that the European Union was constraining how Britain can deal with China. And so the pro-Brexit forces are saying, see, we'll be able to do our own deals with China that will be more advantageous to Britain. Whether that's true or not I don't think it is true. But certainly after Brexit, China becomes much more important for Britain, right? And so there you see an example of how the gravitational force of China and the potential linkages of Belt and Road actually can serve to, so that's not the reason behind Brexit, but it can sort of add to that the sort of splitting up, or it can weaken some of the sort of European ties. Same way, obviously, with sort of U.S. connections. Well, in a slightly different matter, Belt and Road includes Europe in theory, and increasingly, in practice. It will provide overland communications and transport of goods and so on that don't have to go on ships that go through the Straits of Malacca, that go through the Suez Canal, that go through the Persian Gulf, all of these places where the United States can easily interdict and block that kind of communication. Instead, it goes overland through those territories. So it's creating conduits that are free of possible, or freer of possible U.S. Interdiction, U.S. interference. And at least it promises this new one world community of free trade. And there's, again, promises of trade deals with lowered tariffs and so on that will include Europe, but don't seem to include the United States, right? So it's all potential. It's not sort of real right now. There's a lot that would go on, but potentially this could also be seen as a charm offensive, as a effort to bring Europe more into a Chinese orbit and less in the United States orbit. And of course, President Trump is doing everything he can to help our Chinese friends achieve their strategic goals in Eurasia. He's perfect. We think he's helping Putin. He's barely helping Putin. He's really helping Xi Jinping strategically in all of these things. I see it. You're not sure of that. Anyway, the other side of this to look at, or the other aspect that's interesting, is the so-called Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, TPP, which was negotiated over sort of 5 years by the Obama administration. It was an effort to create a treaty governing trade, tariffs, standards, including intellectual property, workers' rights, environmental protections in the Pacific area, including Latin America, Japan, Korea, Australia, Southeast Asia, US, Canada, Mexico, not China. And ultimately, in the future, China could be invited in, but only if they accepted all of the standards about intellectual property and environment and labor and human rights and all that kind of thing. So this was I thought, a very good idea. Depending on how you feel about globalism, you may hate Chiara, I'm sure, hates the idea of global trade. She would have voted for Bernie Sanders if she could. No, I'm kidding. She certainly would not have voted for Hillary, though. Right? Anyway, the irony is, I'll stop, I'm sorry. But the irony is that this was an Obama administration idea. In the course of US politics, which have been so messed up lately, all of the main candidates ended up arguing against the TPP trade. Obviously, Donald Trump, who wants to undermine all of these multilateral trade deals, which he sees as losing for the United States. Hillary Clinton's opponent in the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders, he was opposed to it. He saw it as a big deal. And in the reports and in their speeches, it really sounded like this trade deal was a deal to give away a giveaway to China. It was always talked about as if it included China. And everyone was, Americans were worried, all our jobs are going to go to China. It was compared to the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which was between Canada, Mexico, and the United States, which resulted in dislocations and so on, like this. So even Hillary Clinton turned against it, even though she had negotiated it. It had been negotiated while she was Secretary of State. And what got lost in that whole argument was that it was meant as a hedge against China. It was meant as a strategic balance to China. So what did Donald Trump do on his first day in office? He pulled the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that's why I say he's been the best president for China since probably Richard Nixon, in that regard. You can argue about these trade agreements one way or another. I think there are good things and bad things and so on and so forth. Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau and actually Japan in particular have worked hard to kind of save the idea even without the United States and kind of keep the seat warm for the United States if the United States wants to come back in that, because they see sort of positive things in this. So it may still continue, but certainly the U.S. is not part of it.
About the Trans-Siberian thing that they were saying before, I remember that actually here in Spain we have a train that connects with China. It's called ECO, I think. It goes from Madrid to EU, a city in China. And it transports a lot of products.
Oh, EU, yeah.
Yeah. A lot of products are actually carried from EU to Madrid, but from Madrid to EU, there are not actually a lot of products that Chinese people are interested in buying, like wine or olive oil. So for me, it seems like China has now more to offer to Europe than the other way around. So I wanted to know more or less your opinion on the matter.
So very good, right. So I'm not sure on these maps, and you see all of these silly maps like this that draw lines that that this is the way that the route's going to go, right? So are they saying that if you're going to move something from, so Yiwu is down here somewhere, it's going to go like this, then it's going to go to Moscow, and then it's going to come across? No, this is not the real way that these routes would go. Right now, they're connecting various kinds of existing train lines, and they're saying that there's a train from Yiwu to Madrid, but obviously it's jumping around and using different things. But your question was obviously on the economics of it all, and that's, of course, a good question. And in the United States, we have this problem or this issue of all of the big ships come bringing all the Chinese goods, and they're sold there. And then what happens? We don't have anything to sell back to them, so there's nothing to put in the ships. So what the Chinese bring back is scrap paper, among other things. So waste paper, recycled paper. It turns out the United States has great recycled paper. We throw away paper that's still really good. There's a woman who became a billionaire by processing American scrap paper into the boxes, the cartons that new Chinese products can be put in and then sent back to the United States. So, because you can bring it back in the ship. So, it's a question of what the rail will do, and I don't know if see, that's the thing. That's why I focus on the ideology of it and the broader picture. The economics of any individual train route, any individual port, it's a question whether they really are going to be economical in the way that we think about them. And as you noticed, so yeah. Yiwu is full of, Yiwu actually sells a lot of stuff from Africa, I know. A lot of sort of African products and goods actually end up there, and there's a lot of foreign merchants from all over and Muslim merchants from all over who congregate in that city. It's an interesting place. It's becoming kind of a global enclave within China. The kind of thing that they don't really have otherwise, with sort of lots of expats living in one place. So it is an interesting city, and interesting that Madrid is connected to it.
Maybe I'm an ignorant, but I would like to ask you about the AIIB, because I don't know nothing about it. So if you...
I'm pretty ignorant about it too. It was around the same time as the Belt and Road idea was coming out, maybe a little bit before. China proposed its own Asian Development Bank, industrial infrastructural development bank, looking for partners to put in a foundational investment of several hundreds of millions of dollars or more, and China has put in a big amount, and I don't know the amounts from other countries, but a lot of other countries have put in so that it's capitalized fairly high. And the way that these banks work then is if there's some kind of big development project, building a factory or building a road in some area, then in Central Asia maybe, then this bank will go in and will work with the builders and the countries involved. They'll work out the financing. Supposedly, they maintain some of the standards so that the money is not corrupt. It's not taken away by the local rulers. It's supposed to sort of work and do all that kind of thing. And it's multilateral, so there's multiple partners who put in a percentage. Like the World Bank and the IMF, and the U.S. is supposedly, I think, has the largest capital stock in the World Bank. Therefore, we have more votes and sort of controlling interest in it. This is meant to be a bank that China has controlling interest in, but is nonetheless sort of multilateral. And I said it was a mistake for the U.S. to oppose it because there is need for investment, and there's no reason why China shouldn't have these kinds of things as well, as long as they're being run in a transparent way. And again, I only know from news stories, but the news stories that I've read said that in its first few years, in fact, the AIIB has collaborated with other multilateral, multinational banks and with the World Bank, and it's proving to be a responsible actor like that. So the reports so far are pretty positive. I mean, one thing that is interesting about this Belt and Road and the AIIB is that it's very hard to get international investment in projects in places like Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan or even Pakistan, right? Because they're risky environments. They're poor, or Turkmenistan. I mean, they're relatively poor countries or corrupt countries. Having China's imprimatur behind it, China's sort of backing, and this kind of international bank can in fact make possible these sorts of investments which might not have been done. And they can also pull in kinds of private capital too. A lot of, at least they've been trying to get money from Hong Kong and from the general sort of Pacific area to invest in less developed places. Whether that's going to really happen or not, whether these sort of big global capitalists are going to be eager to lend to this, I don't know. But that's sort of the idea, which is theoretically positive one. Yes. Thanks.
Yeah, but there's something that I can understand in relation to One Belt One Road, and the president of China has said many times that it is a win-win cooperation. And my question is a real balance between China and other countries, or this kind of projects has a part or a country has more
who balanced with China and other countries? Are we? Oh.
Is there a win-win cooperation strategy? Is there one country that wins?
Right. So exactly, that's the key question, right? Is this really multilateral development, altruistic, China wanting to be helpful to its neighbors, or is this just neo-imperialism, right? And I think there's no one answer. And I think sort of the problem in the analysis has been, Belt and Road, is it good or bad? Is it a plot for world domination, or is it the solution to all the world's problems? And it's neither, obviously. It's a lot of different things all at once. Some of these projects will be helpful. And I think, if you want a good example, if you look at Africa, so what China's investment in Africa, I think that's really the same kind of thing. It's proposing that. There have certainly been, and there has begun to be in some places a backlash or criticism of China's investments in Africa. Obviously, there's corruption. Obviously, China is very happy to work with in Zimbabwe, for example, to work with autocratic leaders, whereas European Union and the U.S. and so on, are less likely to do that. But there have also been places where, and this is from African commentators and so on themselves, where Chinese investment has been really helpful. If you build a road and you build it relatively well, all sorts of things can happen along that road. It can be, of real benefit, even if it is we're going to have an argument later about decolonization. So, no, I mean, I'm skeptical too. And I asked some sort of economist friends of mine, what is the story from Africa? And the story is it's mixed. There's bad cases. There's been instances of kind of sort of Chinese racism that sometimes causes problems and so on and so forth. Maybe the Chinese are the new Yankee imperialists. But there's also been projects that have worked, and people have pointed out, because of the Chinese state's willingness to ignore political problems, but also because of Chinese state and also private companies, they're willing to go and invest in places with higher perceived risk than most multinational corporations and other countries. They've gone into many parts of Africa which the West has not, and so they have been there when other countries have not, and this gets a certain amount of sort of respect and gratitude, I think. Again, I'm not an expert on sort of China and Africa, but my sense is it's kind of a mixed story there. It's not all bad, not all good, and I think that's going to be the story with the sort of broader Belt and Road. And I mean, I think there's a bigger problem of China has this broad dream. It's very political, and it's aimed as much as prestige and at bolstering the Chinese Communist Party's reputation domestically, right, in China. It's aimed as much as that as it is at anything else. For that reason, there will be pressure to build things. Just build lots of things. Do lots of investment. They may not all be economically viable. Such as this port in Sri Lanka, it doesn't seem to have enough business right now to really justify such a large port. That was one of the problems. So, although Asia needs infrastructure, the question is whether it needs this much infrastructure, this fast, whether the economies can integrate this kind of thing in a profitable way. And I think that may be sort of ultimately the bigger problem.
En realidad quería preguntar una pregunta muy parecida a la que ha hecho ella, ¿no? De a qué nivel yo veo esto un poco como si la unión que en realidad eso iba a ser casi la pregunta igual que ella, que yo veo esto como una unión geopolítica de Europa y Asia, ¿no? Y de verdad lo veo también como un intento de industrialización perdón, es que entre el ruido de fuera pues de industrialización y de hacer como un crecimiento así más económico. Entonces mi pregunta es, ya sabemos que los países asiáticos ya se ha intentado la industrialización y ya se ha intentado todo esto, y a la temática de cooperación ha fallado un poco, ¿no? Quiero decir, a qué nivel esta cooperación va a tener un desarrollo humano y no económico, cómo va a influir esto a nivel de un desarrollo humano verdadero y no a una industrialización y otra vez más repetir la misma historia que ya se ha hecho anterior y provocar deuda, ¿no? Esta es mi pregunta.
How about the human impact of these measures, and not just economically and socialization, etc., but just
So this is one of the reasons, this is why I'm not one of the cynics who thinks that this is all a bad thing or distrusts China. I've done a lot of work on Chinese minorities, particularly the Uyghur. I know you had Enza Han here speaking about minority issues in China, and so I'm someone who's often very critical of Chinese policies. But I'm not entirely critical or entirely cynical about the Belt and Road, because I think it will encourage precisely the kinds of things that you're talking about. Certainly, we're now at a time when Chinese people are all around the world. We see them much more than they see us. We see them much more than 20 years ago. There are many, many areas of interaction now that are happening. There was a movie that came out last year in China, and it was very popular, most popular movie I think ever in China, more popular even than Titanic, and it was called Wolf Warrior 2, and it's an adventure movie about a Chinese military special operations guy who's in Africa, and he's fighting. He fights against guerrillas who are led by Americans. So the American guerrillas are trying to overthrow a peaceful African country, and the Chinese military saves the country from the American guerrillas, right? So it's flipping around the standard kind of white savior story, and putting Chinese in charge. Fine. But within it, there's lots of scenes with Chinese working with Africans, of Chinese in Africa married to Africans. And the acting is not convincing. There's a very patronizing attitude of China towards sort of Africa that comes through in the movie. But I guess the sense is, even in this very political, hyper-nationalistic movie, the message that this film is giving to Chinese is that we are all friendly and we're going around the world and we're marrying African people. And I'll tell you, 20 years ago, Chinese would not have a movie with Chinese married to African people, right? Because of the sort of intrinsic, racist notions, which 50 years ago you wouldn't see that in an American film either, right? So, but now you're seeing that. So this ideology, this one world kind of ideology, is having an effect, I think. It sort of changes the way Chinese think about the rest of the world, and I think it'll change the way people in the rest of the world think about China insofar as there are more contacts. Sometimes that will be bad if it's a very exploitative project that's clearly not helping, but is simply giving a lot of money to a local dictator. That's not going to help China's reputation. But there are ways it will, and certainly China's investment is being welcomed in Africa. It's being welcomed in Latin America. It's welcomed in many of these places, and there's more and more contact. So I think in that sense, it will have ultimately the effect of opening China to the world and opening the world to China, and at least eliminating some of the mystery that is still often around these things.
¿Alguna otra cuestión?
Sorry, let me just add one more thing. So, particularly in China, I think, it's easy for me to analyze propaganda, and I take it apart, and I say, see, they're doing this, they're doing that. But it's very important, in China, propaganda really matters. I think it matters everywhere, right? It gives us messages, and these messages filter in, and these messages help determine the way in which people think about things. And so the messaging of the Belt and Road is really very positive and inclusive. The practicality, the actual fact may not be, but the messaging is that way. And I think that's going to have an effect in the long run, even if it is nationalistic, on the Chinese approaches to the rest of the world. At least that's what I hope. I'm sorry.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
¿No? De acuerdo, pues nos damos... Sí, Jesús.
I'd like to ask you about territorial claims and disputes. I was wondering if maybe economic investment in certain areas legitimizes political territorial claims. If that might be something that happens.
Yeah, again, very good question. So there, let's see, yes, it was Kazakhstan a few years ago there was one of the most open political demonstrations that Kazakhstan has had since the Soviet, well, ever. And the Kazakh state didn't crack down on these demonstrations the way they normally would. And they were about an issue of land being ceded to China. I'm not sure if it's a territorial dispute or I think it was maybe an agricultural deal, a leasing of lands to China. And there was great popular opposition to it. There have been territorial disputes, I believe, between Tajikistan and China, which have been resolved to the Chinese benefit when there's a big loan involved, right? But it's also gone the other way. China has sort of given a little bit, some of the land back in sort of trying to make a nice deal with Kyrgyzstan. So they're not always using this just to get more land. It's definitely part of the politics. The interesting thing about territorial disputes with China is that the politics is so much more important than the territory itself, right? Ongoing territorial problems with India, these are used for political purposes. They could resolve them if they wanted to. Fights over rocky islands off of Japan, those are highly politicized. The land is not valuable for other than political purposes. So in those places where the territorial disputes have not become politicized, China can be very flexible about them and simply sort of work them out, and have in the past. But I think that India, for example, India has chosen not to join in the one belt, one road game. They're much more skeptical, in large part because this Pakistan economic corridor, can't really see it here, well, it's sort of drawn down here, that goes through territory up in Kashmir and Gilgit, which is Pakistani controlled but Indian disputed, right? And so India cannot sign off on, and that's one of the reasons why sometimes Belt and Road actually does not include this Pakistan corridor. That's sometimes sort of, it's separate, right? I think, because that makes it politically problematic for India. But there's this new assertiveness, in particular with regard to India. And last summer, there was a confrontation actually in Nepal, but it was India supporting Nepal and China sort of building a road in a disputed area. And I think you can see that as part of the broader Chinese kind of maybe encirclement or containment is too strong a term, but strategic moves with regard to India, and those territorial issues are at the center of that. So that's a good point.
Si no hay más cuestiones, pues cerramos esta primera sesión, nos damos 25 minutos de receso y volvemos para ver la película. De nuevo, muchísimas gracias.